Let me just mention a few distinguished guests among a very distinguished list of attendees. Rashad, it's great to see you. Thank you for all your terrific work. The work you do to tighten the ties between the United States and the Islamic world is absolutely critical to our efforts. The President appreciates that. Let me acknowledge also Imam Majid, a fine scholar, a great advocate for tolerance and ecumenism, as is another attendee and a very good friend of mine, His Eminence Cardinal McCarrick, whom I don't see, but there he is. Very good friends. Finally, let me extend President Obama's gratitude to His Highness Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani and His Excellency the Prime Minister Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim Al Thani for hosting this important dialogue. On behalf of the President, I would like to convey our deepest sympathies to the families of those who lost their lives on Monday in the tragic fire in the mall. When the Emir visited President Obama last spring in Washington, the President was impressed with his leadership on issues in the region like Syria and Libya, and on global issues like food security and on climate. It's fitting that you gather again in Doha this year after coming to Washington last year. Doha is at the geographic crossroads of the Islamic world, which stretches from Marrakesh to Kuala Lumpur. In the United States, we're proud to be the home to more than 3 million Muslims. So perhaps I should say that the Muslim world stretches from Minneapolis, in my home state of Minnesota, which is represented in the United States Congress by a proud Muslim American congressman, to Kuala Lumpur. The theme of this year's forum is also timely. Across the Middle East and North Africa, a new generation is rising, raising its voice and seeking new direction. The challenges and opportunities of this change are something that President Obama understands very well. In fact, bringing about change has been central to his life and public service, and it shapes his approach to American foreign policy, especially in this region. Consider that in 2009, many of our relationships across this region were either frayed or stagnant. We are weighed down by 2 wars. Osama bin Laden was still on the run. Iran believed itself ascendant, and the prospect of real democratic reform in the region seemed to be a distant dream. What a difference 3 years makes. Today, let me focus on 3 areas of that particular change where the relationship between the United States and this region is changing particularly. First, President Obama is fulfilling his promise to move the United States beyond a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, even as we continue to meet the very real threat of al-Qaeda. In his speech in Cairo, President Obama said he would remove all of our troops from Iraq by 2012. This, like so much of his other accomplishments, is exactly what the United States did. The last American troops left Iraq in December. For the first time in 9 years, there are no Americans fighting in Iraq. Now, instead, we're building an enduring partnership to advance the security and prosperity of the Iraqi people. In Afghanistan, we are also winding down a war. As a result of the good work of coalition troops and Afghan security forces, President Karzai recently announced that 75% of all Afghans now live in areas that are in the process of transitioning to Afghan security forces lead. At the NATO summit last week in Chicago, our allies and partners, a group of more than 50 nations, unified behind the plan to begin to bring the war to responsible close. Afghan forces will be in the lead for combat operations across the country by next year, and by the end of 2014 will be fully responsible for security across the entire country. As we responsibly end the war in Afghanistan, we've also learned the lessons of 1989 in that country. We've signaled our long-term commitment to Afghanistan through the Strategic Partnership Agreement that Presidents Obama and Karzai signed earlier this month in Kabul. In that partnership, we committed to support Afghanistan's social and economic development, security, institutions, and regional cooperation. In return, the Afghan government committed to strengthen accountability, transparency, oversight, and to protect the human rights of all Afghans, men and women, boys and girls. This progress in Iraq and Afghanistan is changing America's military footprint in this region. 4 years ago, the United States had 180,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've already cut that number by more than half, and as more Afghans step up, more of our forces will come home. In words and deeds, we are turning the page on a decade of war and bringing about a new chapter of engagement with Iraq, Afghanistan, and, as you've all discussed the last couple of days, Muslim communities around the globe. We're under no illusions about how hard these wars have been, both for our own troops and for the citizens who have lived through them. What cannot be denied, however, is that positive change can be seen in Afghanistan and Iraq. Both countries now have the opportunity to affirm their own sovereignty and shape their own future. In Iraq, if the country's leaders choose to govern for all Iraqis rather than themselves, there is a remarkable potential to create new wealth and opportunity. For the first time in decades, a democratically elected partnership government brings together all the major blocs, and the multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian military answers to the civilians. To be sure, the partnership government is unwieldy and fraught with tension, and success will require difficult compromise. But the fact is that politics has supplanted violence as the means by which each group seeks to protect and advance its own interests. And in Afghanistan, we're hopeful that as we complete the security transition I just talked about, a political process can reconcile Afghans with one another and allow the Afghan people to live in the peace that has eluded them now for far too long, while protecting the gains for women and girls especially of the last decade. At the same time, we are winning the war against al-Qaeda. Since the beginning of this administration, we've made it clear that we are not at war with Islam, which is a great world religion, nor are we at war with terrorism, which is a tactic. We are at war with al-Qaeda, an organization whose only aim is to destroy, not build. An organization whose attacks have resulted in the deaths of innocent men, women, and children, the vast majority of whom have been Muslim. What some have dubbed the long war, we have instead made a much more focused and precise war. The death of bin Laden was our most strategic blow yet against al-Qaeda and has enabled us to put al-Qaeda on a pathway to defeat. In Pakistan, al-Qaeda's leadership has continued to suffer heavy losses. We've put the leadership core in the tribal regions on the path to defeat. In other areas, we will continue to work with our partners to deliver blows against al-Qaeda affiliates, like al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But more importantly, we believe that the changes that are sweeping across the region, where a new generation is peacefully affecting the change that al-Qaeda's senseless violence could never bring, will continue driving al-Qaeda and its tired narrative further into irrelevance. Last week at our Air Force Academy, President Obama described how, even as we've done the work of ending these wars, we've laid the foundation for a new era of American leadership, an era where we work with other nations using all elements of our power: diplomatic, economic, development, and the power of our ideals. You see this new, broader engagement around the world, and you see it particularly in this region. Of course, this shift away from war comes at a time when this region is undergoing profound change. President Obama views this intersection as a tremendous opportunity for the United States and our partners in the region to focus on a new affirmative agenda. With the end of these wars and broader American engagement, we have an unprecedented opportunity to focus more closely on the challenges that matter most to millions of people in their daily lives: how to provide a brighter future for all of our children, how to confront and end global poverty, how to fight corruption, promote good governance, enhance political reform, human rights, and economic growth. What's clear about the events of the past year and a half is that change has now come to the region. And importantly, there is no turning back. There are now 4 countries undergoing democratic transitions: Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. For the first time, the Egyptian people went to the polls just last week to vote in an election for president, where they had a very real choice. This election marks an important milestone in Egypt's transition to democracy, and we look forward to working with whomever the Egyptian people elect as their president in the runoff next month. The Libyan people are preparing for their first democratic election in the history of their country, and the Tunisians are drafting a new constitution. There are, of course, risks in the Arab Spring. Change is difficult, and it is never linear. The transitions underway face enormous challenges. It will take decades, not years, decades, for the change unleashed in the streets of Tunis and Tahrir Square to play out. New governments will be tested by the circumstances and will be judged by their actions. There are high expectations among their people to deliver swiftly on the promises of these revolutions and these new times. So let me speak candidly about the role of the United States. First, history will show that we stood on the side of change from the beginning of these events. We embraced the transformation in Tunisia. We sided with the aspirations of citizens on the streets in Egypt, even though the United States knew very well the leader that was overthrown, because we believe that Egypt is made stronger by electing a government that is responsive to its people. We led an intervention to protect the people of Libya. We worked diligently for months, literally months, to support the transition of power that has taken place in Yemen. And in countries like Bahrain, which I just visited, Morocco, and Jordan, we have been advocates for reform. And in Syria, we stand for the dignity of the Syrian people, who deserve a new government that represents its citizens instead of killing them. As the President made clear last May, the United States has a long-standing core national interest in the region that endure. These interests will endure, and we will continue to aggressively engage, including the preservation of the peace treaty with Israel, maintaining the free flow of commerce, preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, and disrupting terrorist threats. But we also affirm, as the President did last May, our interest in the success of the change that is sweeping the region. There should be no doubt the United States has a vital national interest in the consolidation of democratic change and the emergence of governments that are more responsive to their people. The theory that repressive rule was a recipe for stability has fundamentally been proven wrong. It was, in fact, a path, as we've seen, to instability. Unless the foundations of the rule of law, accountability, transparency, and justice are strengthened, the region risks falling behind the rest of the world. Until reforms are made to advance inclusive economic growth, attract private investment, increase trade, and cultivate entrepreneurship, the next generation will find itself increasingly difficult and unable to compete in a global economy. Indeed, we have seen in other regions how these processes are interdependent. Freedom, dignity, transparency, and accountability are the necessary components for sustainable growth and stability. I know there's a debate, including among all of you here in this conference over the last couple of days, about what role the United States has played and should play in this part of the world where history is so complex and, in candor, so close at hand. On one hand, there are those who advocate more direct U.S. involvement to help solve problems. On the other are still others who do not want the United States to meddle in the affairs of these or any other countries. So let me be very clear. When we say we are not going to determine the destiny of change, we mean what we say. It's not up to America to determine the region's leaders or write your constitutions. We respect, and we will continue to respect, the will of the people. We will work with whomever you elect, provided they respect universal rights. At the same time, we're prepared to be a partner. That is why President Obama said in May last year that if you take the risks that reform entails, you will have the full support of the United States. This is manifest in the political partnerships we're building with newly elected governments and the economic support we're providing countries in the transition. Over the past year, we have already mobilized $800 million to support transitions and lay foundations for sustained progress. Looking ahead, we'll build on this, including through our proposed Middle East and North Africa initiative, an incentive fund, designed in part to support the efforts of those governments with the political will to commit to democratic change, build effective institutions, and take the often difficult steps needed to sustain broad-based economic growth. We're leveraging other economic tools as well, including loan guarantees, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and we are continuing to enlist the help of international community, as the President did just last weekend at Camp David with the G8 Deauville Partnership to reinforce our efforts. The President's made clear that America will lead on behalf of human dignity and freedom. We do so not just because it's at the core of who we are as Americans, but because it's also in our interests. Our closest allies and partners around the world are democracies. And in this sense, in the most basic terms, the United States of America is bound fundamentally to the Arab Spring. Earlier this month, I told another audience that the Arab Spring also plays to America's comparative and competitive strengths: respect for the individual, freedom of expression and assembly, innovation, and entrepreneurship. It's important to remember that America itself was born out of revolution against an empire. We know what it means to construct a nation, to draft a constitution, to live by its mandate, to go to the polls, and to build political parties. But those are just the mechanics of democracy. The test of all democracies is ultimately whether they can hold themselves accountable. New governments emerging in the Middle East and North Africa will need to put in place their own checks and balances, protect and empower the weakest among them, ensure peaceful transfers of power between democratically elected governments, and celebrate, not fear, civil society. Unfortunately, fear and brute force remains the currency of the Assad regime in Syria, a regime fundamentally at odds with the democratic forces sweeping the region. The violence the regime has perpetrated on the Syrian people negates any claim to legitimacy. The most recent and appalling of the regime's many atrocities was the Hula massacre, substantially, overwhelmingly, of women and children, just this last weekend. You've all heard the claims that local vigilantes, known as Shabiha, committed over 100 murders and over 300 maimings in that town on Saturday, and that the regime itself bears no responsibility. This is a lie. We know that the regime controls the actions of the Shabiha and pays the salaries, and regime insiders pay the salaries of those thugs. President Obama has made our position on Syria imminently clear, but it bears repeating. First, we will continue to support the UN Security Council efforts to find a political solution to end the violence and lay the foundation for a democratic transition through Joint Special Envoy Kofi Annan's efforts. However, it is our belief, and evidence of this is mounting, that putting monitors into the country is not simply going to stop the violence. There needs to be a credible political transition process that gets underway. Second, we will also continue to work outside the United Nations with like-minded partners to increase pressure on the Assad regime through broad implementation of sanctions and through diplomatic isolation. The Friends of Syria group continues to work to undermine the political, military, and economic powers that have kept the Syrian people divided against one another and the Assad regime in power. Third, we're strangling the regime economically, and we'll tighten our concerted efforts to do so at the Friends of Syria meeting in Washington on June 6. Our objectives, and we're moving closer to them, are straightforward: starve the regime of the resources it requires to pay the army and deprive Assad's cronies of the money they need to buy the Shabiha's brutal conspiracy. As part of our efforts, we'll continue to strengthen the Syrian people through our provision of non-lethal assistance, including communications and medical equipment to the political opposition. Finally, we will continue our work to lead the world to address the humanitarian situation and provide emergency humanitarian aid to the people of Syria. No one can know exactly when or how, but this much is certain. The Syrian people will indeed find justice. Like so many despotic regimes before it, the Assad clique will end up ultimately in the dustbin of history, and the people of Syria will have a chance to determine their own destiny. When that happens, it will also be the most profound strategic setback that Syria's closest ally, Iran, has faced in decades. That is surely why Iran has provided material support and advice to the regime in brutalizing the Syrian people. This weekend's admission from Tehran that, quote, if the Islamic Republic was not present in Syria, the massacre of the people would have happened on a much larger scale, is remarkable, though less so than the subsequent backtracking on official media sites that sought to cover up this earlier and stunning admission. The result of this cynical assistance has only further alienated Iran from the region. It's one more example of how Iran's leaders are fundamentally out of step with the region and with the world. Since taking office, President Obama has made it clear that the United States is prepared to work with Iran, both on its rights and its responsibilities as a member of the international community. For the past 3.5 years, we've offered Iran's leaders a choice. Meet your international obligations and rejoin the community of nations, or continue to flout your responsibilities and face even greater isolation and pressure. At every turn, Iran's leaders have rejected logical, reasonable approaches to resolving the world's concerns about its nuclear program. At every turn, they have failed to seize the multiple opportunities before them. As a result, the international community is now more unified than ever. The world has imposed the strongest sanctions on Iran to date, which we believe is the reason they've returned, finally, to negotiation. We pursue this path not only because it's in the interest of preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which would have grave consequences for the security of this region and the world. We do so because we support the aspirations of the Iranian people, especially its young people, who deserve a future much better than the one their leaders are creating for them by failing to live up to these international responsibilities. That brings me back to the theme of this year's forum, New Voices, and to the most important message I want to leave with the audience today. The United States and the Islamic world have to work together to right the ship for the generations that follow. As you all know, over 60% of the region is under 30. Several countries have 30% or more of the population between the ages of 15 and 29, with some median ages dipping below 20. And even when the proportion of youth is dropping, the numbers will be rising for decades to come, requiring tens of millions of new jobs to employ these young people. On top of this demographic challenge, the new generation is more empowered, connected, and vocal than any of its predecessors. Their expectations for civic and economic opportunity are rising, and we must all find a way to fulfill the aspirations. Having driven several of the revolutions around the region, youth have shown their ability to shape public debate and challenge traditional order. But ensuring their political participation, economic opportunity, and voice is essential to addressing both political and the economic issues in the region going forward. Where youth aspire to build stable and prosperous societies, the United States will stand with those aspirations and do everything it can to support them. As the President said in Cairo, equipping this new generation for success in the 21st century will require providing the necessary education and skills, unlocking the potential of the region's girls and young women, and fostering a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation. Since then, since the Cairo speech, the United States has prioritized engaging with this group and helping to marshal the best of American higher education, innovation, and society as partners in this effort. On education, we've brokered dozens of partnerships between leading United States institutions and universities throughout the Muslim world. We've expanded scholarship to enable students to access education in their own communities as well as in the United States. In the 2 years after President Obama's commitment in Cairo, the United States increased the number of Middle Eastern and North African students studying in the U.S. by 25%. But we don't simply see this as a one-way exchange. Our citizens have much to learn from the institutions and young people in this region. In the years after the Cairo address, the number of U.S. students in the Middle East and North Africa has grown by 35%. We've heard the desire among youth and governments alike to expand English teaching to ensure young people are equipped with this critical skill to succeed in the global economy. We've expanded our English teaching programs 40% to now directly hire 20,000 students across the Muslim world and thousands of teachers of English. We've launched entrepreneurship and vocational skills training programs to ensure that skills that youth acquire enable them to find economic opportunity in the workforce, helping to build innovative businesses. We expand partnerships with industry associations in the private sector to help ensure that students graduate with the skills needed by the market. We are pairing young entrepreneurs with business mentors in the United States and run business plan competitions, seeking young people's best and brightest ideas. And finally, we also recognize that the youth are not merely calling for education and better job opportunities. They are calling for dignity. This demands a role in deciding the future of their societies. We all have an interest in making sure that the enthusiasm and interest displayed over the past 2 years does not atrophy, or worse, sour. But make no mistake, the United States can only be a partner in this endeavor. It's up to the leaders in this room and Muslim communities around the world to take seriously the opportunities as well as the challenges presented by this new, young, and growing generation. So in closing, I want to go back to something I said at the beginning. President Obama views the intersection of events in the region as an unbelievable and unprecedented opportunity for all of us. I know that some people in the region, in fact, some people in the room, for them, the promise of the President's Cairo speech is yet to be fulfilled. I share that view. As President Obama has said, we knew that his vision would not be fulfilled in a single year or even in several years. But we knew we had to begin, and that all of us have to take our part of the responsibilities to fulfill. At the end of that speech in Cairo, here's what he said. We have a responsibility to join together on behalf of the world we seek, a world where extremists no longer threaten our people, and American troops have come home, a world where Israelis and Palestinians each secure in a state of their own, and nuclear energy is used for peaceful purposes, a world where governments serve their citizens, and the rights of all of God's children are respected. That is the world we seek, but we can only achieve it together. I can tell you today that President Obama firmly believes that those continue to be shared interests, and that working together in partnership, we can achieve them. So much progress has been made in the last 3 years, but there is much, much yet to be done. While the road we must take will be long and at sometimes arduous, I'm confident that we'll be able to achieve the world we seek if we move forward in the spirit of mutual interest and mutual respect. So thank you all very much for the opportunity to talk with you today. I look forward to taking your questions.